By the end of World War II, German commanders who had conquered most of Europe in a matter of months were filing detailed post-war assessments explaining why they had lost. Across dozens of interrogation transcripts, memoirs, and intelligence reports, one pattern emerges with remarkable consistency. When German officers were asked which Allied force they found most difficult to fight, most dangerous to face, and most impossible to predict, the answer was not the British, who had been fighting since 1939. It was not the Soviets, whose sheer numerical weight had ground down the Eastern Front. It was the Americans, a force they had openly dismissed as militarily irrelevant as recently as 1942. To understand why requires looking beyond individual battles and casualty figures, and into how the American military was designed, how it learned from failure faster than any army in modern history, why that combination produced a fighting force that German doctrine had no framework to counter, and what the German commanders who faced the Americans actually thought, documented, and confessed in captivity. German military intelligence assessments of American fighting capacity before direct contact were not based on ignorance. They were based on evidence, and that evidence genuinely supported their conclusions. In 1939, the United States Army ranked 19th in the world by total size, smaller than the armies of Portugal and Romania. American industrial capacity was oriented toward consumer goods rather than war production. The nation had not fought a major land war in over 2 decades, and its officer corps had accumulated almost no experience in the kind of large-scale mechanized warfare that had already defined the European conflict. Nazi ideology reinforced these assessments with the weight of supposed racial theory. Hitler and his senior commanders believed national military strength flowed directly from cultural and racial cohesion. A nation of immigrants drawn from every corner of the globe, they argued, could not produce the collective fighting spirit that defined the German soldier. These were not fringe opinions held by ideologues on the margins of the military establishment. They were shared by professional military men who had spent their careers studying the relationship between society and combat effectiveness, and who genuinely believed the available evidence supported their framework. The memory of the First World War added another layer of confidence. American troops had arrived in France in 1917 and performed adequately in the final campaigns, but they had entered late, suffered comparatively light casualties, and contributed little to the war's strategic direction. German officers who had faced those soldiers remembered enthusiasm without discipline and courage without tactical sophistication. The idea that a new generation would be fundamentally different seemed to men who had studied military history their entire professional lives simply implausible. When American forces met the Wehrmacht in combat at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, every one of those assumptions appeared validated with devastating completeness. The command failures on the American side were comprehensive at every level. Forces were dispersed across an indefensible front. The Corps headquarters was positioned 70 miles behind the line in an elaborate underground bunker. Orders were confused, communications fragmented, and tactical awareness at every level of command was almost entirely absent. Rommel's Afrika Korps drove through American positions with a speed and ease that seemed to confirm everything German intelligence had predicted. The conclusions German commanders drew from Kasserine were logical, given the evidence available to them. The Americans had broken under pressure from veteran formations. Their equipment had been abandoned in the desert. Their officers had demonstrated no capacity for rapid decision-making under stress. 6,500 American casualties in 6 days, including 3,000 captured, represented a performance that by any professional military standard justified contempt rather than concern. What German analysis failed to account for, however, was the nature of what they were actually observing. Kasserine was not a measurement of American military potential. It was a snapshot of an army at its absolute earliest stage of combat experience, under catastrophically poor leadership, before any of the institutional lessons of modern warfare had been absorbed and applied. The German military, shaped by a culture that treated battlefield reversal as evidence of permanent incapacity, had no conceptual framework for understanding an organization that treated failure as data rather than verdict. Within weeks of the disaster, Friedendahl was relieved. Patton took command of Second Corps, and a transformation began that would accelerate beyond anything Rommel or his staff considered remotely possible. Of all the elements that made American forces genuinely feared by German troops, veterans and captured officers identified one above every other with remarkable consistency across post-war accounts. Not tanks, not fighter bombers, not the sheer volume of American material output. It was artillery, and more specifically, the American system of artillery coordination that had no equivalent in any other army in the world, including the Wehrmacht. The Fire Direction Center system developed at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. During the interwar years, represented a fundamental rethinking of how artillery functioned on the battlefield, where German and British systems tied forward observers to specific batteries through direct communication links, with each battery operating largely according to its own assessment. The American system centralized fire control at the battalion level in a way that multiplied effectiveness exponentially. Any observer anywhere on the battlefield could request fire from any battery within range. Those requests could be escalated from battalion to division to corps level with a speed that German command structures could not approach, concentrating the guns of an entire army on a single target when the situation demanded it. The practical time difference this created was devastating in its battlefield consequences. American artillery could place shells on a target within approximately 3 minutes of a fire request. German systems required 10 to 12 minutes to achieve equivalent results and rarely achieved the same concentration across multiple units. For infantry in exposed positions, that difference was not a tactical inconvenience. It was the difference between taking cover and being killed before cover was possible. The technique known as time on target, in which batteries at varying distances calculated their firing time so that shells from dozens of guns arrived simultaneously within seconds, added a psychological dimension to the physical destruction that German soldiers found deeply unsettling. There was no warning salvo to send soldiers diving for cover. There was silence, and then instantaneous saturation from every direction at once. The introduction of the proximity fuse in late 1944 multiplied this further, producing airbursts above foxholes and trenches that had previously offered reliable protection and effectively removing the last refuge available to infantry under sustained artillery attack. The artillery system demonstrated American superiority at the level of doctrine and technology. What demonstrated their superiority at the level of organizational culture was something different, and in many respects more significant. It was the speed and method by which the army solved problems it had never anticipated, and for which no existing doctrine provided answers. The bocage country of Normandy in the summer of 1944 presented exactly this kind of problem. The ancient hedgerows, earthen banks up to 15 feet high topped with dense vegetation, turned every small field into a natural fortress. Tanks could not push through without climbing over them, and that exposed thin belly armor to anti-tank fire from every angle. Infantry advancing without armor was cut apart by German machine gun positions with interlocking fields of fire. The offensive stalled in a costly deadlock that produced thousands of casualties for gains measured in yards rather than miles. The solution did not come from division headquarters or from a directive issued by First Army. It came from Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 2nd Armored Division, who fabricated steel prongs from German beach obstacles salvaged from the Normandy coast and welded them to Sherman tanks, allowing the vehicles to drive through hedgerows at ground level rather than over them. General Omar Bradley saw a demonstration and immediately ordered mass production. Within 3 weeks, 3 out of every 5 tanks in First Army mounted the device, and the solution had spread laterally through informal networks across the entire army without waiting for formal approval or top-down distribution. This was not an isolated incident of battlefield ingenuity. It was a repeating pattern that revealed something fundamental about American military culture, one that actively encouraged improvisation at every level, treated the soldier in the field as a source of tactical intelligence, rather than simply an instrument of orders from above. and possessed institutional mechanisms for converting individual solutions into army-wide practice with a speed that German organizational structures were fundamentally unable to match. Operation Cobra on July 25, 1944, demonstrated the full maturity of this system, combining carpet bombing, armor, infantry, and coordinated air support in an operation that shattered the German line and opened France to the kind of sweeping mobile offensive that German doctrine had long believed only the Wehrmacht itself was capable of executing. Hitler's decision to launch the Ardennes offensive in December 1944 rested partly on a belief that had survived 2 years of contradicting evidence. He still expected American soldiers to crack under the shock of a determined surprise assault, as they had at Kasserine. The offensive achieved complete tactical surprise, struck through fog and snow that grounded Allied aircraft, and initially shattered thinly held American positions across a 50-mile front. What followed in the days after that initial shock dismantled the last remnant of that belief permanently. At Lanzerath Ridge, 18 men from an intelligence and reconnaissance platoon, joined by 4 artillery observers, held their isolated position against approximately 500 German paratroopers for nearly 18 hours, disrupting the carefully planned German timetable and buying time that proved strategically consequential across the entire front. At Elsenborn Ridge, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions blocked the entire 6th SS Panzer Army, the main effort of the German offensive, and held that line without yielding. The 12th SS Panzer Division, which had expected to lead the breakthrough to Antwerp, was so badly damaged in repeated attacks against these positions that it never recovered as an effective fighting formation. At Bastogne, the surrounded 101st Airborne Division held its perimeter through days of bitter fighting in freezing conditions, until Patton's Third Army pivoted, moving over 100,000 men 90 degrees northward through winter terrain and relieved the siege within days. That was one of the most demanding logistical and tactical achievements of the entire war. Winston Churchill addressed the House of Commons shortly afterward and described the battle as the greatest American battle of the war. The contrast with German expectations going in could not have been more complete. The post-war assessments left by German commanders who faced American forces are among the most useful documents available for understanding what specifically made those forces feared rather than merely respected. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of German armored doctrine and the man who developed the Blitzkrieg concepts that conquered France in 1940, acknowledged Patton's operations as tactically equivalent to what he himself would have attempted under similar circumstances. Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations at German Supreme Headquarters, stated plainly during his captivity that the war in the West was already lost at the moment of the Cobra breakthrough. Blumentritt identified Patton specifically as the Allied commander who came closest to the German concept of classical military command, noting that he had improved on Napoleon's principle of speed. What all of these assessments share is that none of them attribute German fear of American forces to the qualities of the individual American soldier in direct combat. What they identify, consistently and specifically, is the system behind that soldier. The artillery that could mass hundreds of guns on a single target faster than German command structures could respond. The logistics that kept ammunition and replacements flowing in quantities that made attrition impossible. The organizational culture that converted failure into institutional knowledge. And the combined arms coordination that multiplied the effectiveness of every individual in uniform beyond what raw performance alone would predict. The American military that German commanders came to fear was not the army that arrived at Kasserine in February 1943. It was what that army became through a process of accelerated learning that no German model had anticipated and no German doctrine was equipped to counter. That transformation, from the most humiliating defeat in American military history to the force that broke the Wehrmacht in the West, remains one of the most significant institutional achievements in the history of modern warfare. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing and liking the video.